Books make you hope. Books make you dream. Books make you laugh. Books make you scream. This is the Books That Make You show, discussing books with authors and experts, unraveling the inner pages of all the books that help make us who we are. Hosted by Desiree Duffy.
It is time for us to have some book-ish fun. Welcome to Books That Make You. I'm your host, Desiree Duffy. How's it going? You know what we're going to talk about today? We're talking about books that make you explore the shades and shadows of dark fiction. Dark fiction, horror, thrillers, dark fantasy, mysteries and science fiction and more. What is it that makes fiction dark? Why is it that we enjoy curling up with something that's going to scare the bejesus out of us? Or better yet, do you like listening to books or listening to scary stories? It is honestly one of my favorite things. I love listening to author readings where they share excerpts from their books and I can get lost in their writing through their words. There's something primal about listening to a story, like ancient people circling a fire, sharing tales of the beasts that stalk them in the woods, or the dangers that lurk in the shadows. We have this need to listen and share dark stories in the oral tradition. Our guest today is the founder of Shades and Shadows. He organizes author readings, events where they share their writing with the audience. These are wonderful community events, and it's a huge support to authors as well. Xach Fromson, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Why is it? Why do you think, you're the expert here, why do people like listening to scary stories?
Scary stories feed a fundamental nature, or fundamental part of human nature, in that there's usually some aspect of morality or empathy or emotional investment that we get. And there's a catharsis that comes through experiencing, whether it's explicitly horror or just anything that's kind of dark, any sort of confrontation that's inherent in that allows us as human beings to confront things that are maybe a little bit too uncomfortable for us to focus on straight ahead. So scary stories offer us an allegory or a metaphor that often allow us to process emotions and process our own needs within the safety and the confines of something that we know to be fictional, know to be false.
Yeah, because oftentimes the monster in the house is actually the monster in ourselves. There's a psychological aspect to it, and that's what's really cool about unraveling that.
Yeah, well, any really well-conceived, well-executed monster is going to but not only reflect the protagonist of the story, assuming the monster isn't the protagonist, but also is going to reflect something in us as the reader. And again, well-executed monsters don't just speak to one particular type of person. They have some aspect of them that speaks to a lot of us, or ideally all of us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's the fear of what we could become, or what we are, or what our society has made us.
Yeah, and sometimes it's the fear of the unknown. Sometimes it's the fear of death, which for a lot of us is the same thing. But yeah, there's always some aspect of what we don't want to admit is real, or what we're afraid could become real.
So what is, in your opinion, dark fiction? Can we define that? It seems like it's rising in popularity. I feel like there's a lot more horror and dark fantasy out on the market. Why do you think that is?
It's hard to define. Horror in particular is hard to define because it's equal parts genre and narrative device. Mm-hmm. The easiest kind of pop culture reference that I can give to explain that is Alien, the first one, the 1979 one, is horror and sci-fi, mm-hmm. whereas Aliens is a sci-fi movie with elements of horror as a narrative device. And so it's kind of hard to draw exactly where that line is. And really, we've always had dark fiction. I don't know about always on the forefront, but it's always been present. There's never been a point where we just eschewed it entirely. There's been times where it was frowned upon. And I think that if you look at the lull in horror movies in particular, up until fairly recently, that were any good, then, again, lull, there were always some, but then all of a sudden it became a bigger thing. You get this idea that we're rediscovering something. And the last time that happened, we were rediscovering something. And the last time that happened, we were rediscovering something. But it's always been there. Because at the heart of dark fiction is that sense of confrontation with the unknown or with the impossible. And whether we're talking about zombies and them having their heyday, I think the current wave really didn't start with supernatural dark fiction. I'd argue that it started with The Wire, because The Wire gave us this modern anti-hero. Mm-hmm. And it gave us this grim, dark resurgence, and that allowed things like the Christopher Nolan Batman movies, and that kind of reinvigorated our excitement and our interest and our willingness to delve into the psychological darkness and the economic and the social darkness that has become more and more pervasive, not just in recent years, but over the last number of years.
It is a response to the society and the world that we're living in. Going all the way back to Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, yeah, it was a monster. It's also sci-fi, but it was also based on the fear of us tampering with the essence of life. And I feel like nowadays, too, even in the crossovers where you have that darkness inside of our superheroes, and superheroes, that genre has just exploded, obviously, with the Marvel Universe and everything. And it seems like that is also a response to the world around us. We crave, we need heroes right now because in so many ways we feel out of control. And my God, wouldn't it be nice if somebody could just come along and save us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And read what you want to into that as far as us giving up our own power, seeking for an authoritarian solution to an authoritarian problem. Like, there's plenty that you can unpack from our need, in quotes, for superheroes. But yeah, a lot of that, and a lot of that is also just that culturally, with the advent of social media, we learned that we, as one type of nerd, weren't necessarily alone. That if you were even LiveJournal, pre-social media, a lot of times we felt very isolated, very outcast. And then as we started to form online communities and as things like online fandoms began to take root and then to flourish, we discovered that there's frankly a lot of us. Mm-hmm. And as the tech industries became more and more pervasive in every aspect of our American culture, at least, we had this community kind of arise, and that whole "the geek shall inherit the earth" thing. And so there was just an increasing fascination with, I don't know about fascination. There was an increase in a willingness to admit that you were into these kinds of things. And it hit a threshold with the first Iron Man movie. And that kind of took off. But I don't know that you could have had that without movies like The Matrix first, and without, which was also released the same year as what I personally consider narratively to be a better movie, which was The 13th Floor, which is based on a book called Simulacron 3, which was published in 1964 and is still ahead of its time. So that's what I mean. Like, it's always been there. We're just sort of discovering it because we weren't told about it. And now with the complete sum total of human knowledge and a bunch of things that are not human knowledge available to us through the internet, we're able to source and locate all of this information so much more easily.
I agree. Even growing up, I was one of those geeky kids that played Dungeons and Dragons. And you know what? I didn't tell a lot of my friends about it. I kept my geeky friends separate from the other friends because, wow, would I get blasted for that? Being a nerd or being part of that, liking superheroes, liking zombies, liking horror, especially for a girl, that was just weird. I was odd. And you're right. Nowadays, because of the internet and because of the embracing of technology and the love of being a nerd or a geek or however you want to classify it, it's allowed that to flourish. Even looking at something like Game of Thrones. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they barely got it made the way it was, but the idea of bringing fantasy to that production level was insane because they never thought that the audience would be there for it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And then if you look at what that spawned, I think that a week from now, next Friday, I think, is the drop date for Good Omens on Amazon. Mm-hmm. And that's the Neil Gaiman, Terry Pratchett novel, which first off had to wait for the technology to catch up to do it the right way. And I think that's also part of it as far as movies and TV are concerned. But I think that without the runaway success of Game of Thrones, that there would be a lot more hesitancy to allow for big budget sci-fi and fantasy shows. And I think without some of those breakaway hits, you would still be seeing the kind of B-level, C-level sci-fi fantasy shows that were the staple of the Sci-Fi Channel, over a decade ago. Mm-hmm. And then even then, like the Sci-Fi Channel now is having to do a lot more big budget stuff. Everyone's kind of pumping more money into it because this is where all of our interests are. And I don't think that it's, new. It's just that there's more of us who are willing to admit that it's something that we like because over the last 15, 20 years, we've discovered that there's more of us who like it. And it created this vicious circle of a positive type, or a positive feedback loop, I guess we can call it, that allowed more content for more readers because there was more interest. And then that additional content generated new readers, new fans. And and again, I don't think we can discount Harry Potter in that by any stretch. I think that without J.K. Rowling and without the runaway success of the books and then the movies, that we would be having these conversations.
Excellent point. Now, you've mentioned some authors, obviously J.K. Rowling, Terry Pratchett, Neil Gaiman. Who are some of for people especially who might not be as versed in dark fiction or fantasy horror, who are some of the names, the authors, the books that you feel are the definitive guide or that people should be reading or aware of nowadays?
Oh, man. Nowadays, honestly, I need to plug another podcast for that one. There's a podcast run by friends of mine called Ladies of the Fright. And they are really, they've got their fingers on the pulse of a lot of the horror markets. And they were just recently awarded, I think, the best nonfiction podcast by This Is Horror. And so they're definitely the ones that I would recommend checking out. But as far as current names, I'm trying to think of just the people that I've had on my show. Mm-hmm. And my brain is having trouble latching on to some of them, but there's always the ones that we look for that transcend the barriers, that transcend the boundaries, because people love to categorize. It's just kind of a human nature thing. And when something comes along that resists categorization, it makes people pay attention. And a couple of years ago, Victor Laval's novel, The Ballad of Black Tom, dropped, and that got noticed on NPR, and it got national publicity, and it was a Lovecraftian horror story, but where Lovecraft was and remains a very problematic figure for his racism and his bigotry, Victor Laval is a black man in New York who took the elements of Lovecraftian horror and reclaimed the power that is necessary for today's market, and just really used it to make this marvelous novella. And he's done other things since then. The Changeling, he's got the graphic novel that is on my shelf, and I'm suddenly blanking on the name of it. Destroyer. Victor Laval's Destroyer.
Okay.
I think that's absolutely a good starting place. And honestly, if you look at what's been successful in the movies recently, it's been Jordan Peele. Right. So a lot of what's interesting, not only in horror, but in science fiction and in fantasy, is that there's finally this acceptance of the non-straight white men writing in the genre. And the cool thing that I've discovered within the confines of my own show is that the straight white men who are writing in these genres love it. And I've very rarely encountered any opinion from the old guard that's going, oh, this is bad because those people are, racist. And so they don't voice their opinions, at least in Los Angeles, very loudly. But it's this incredible, I'm on a black cyberpunk kick right now. And I went on Twitter because I was having trouble finding stuff. And Nisi Shawl responded and said, hey, I'm black and I write cyberpunk, and check out my stuff. And then I got recommended this other anthology called The City, a cyberpunk anthology. And I found a couple of other things through this Twitter interaction, and it's been great. And so I'm just loving all of that. And, N.K. Jemisin and Nnedi Okorafor and Nala Hopkinson, all of these people are getting read. And it's Octavia, but even then we're talking about this sense of it being new, but Octavia Butler was writing for decades and she was winning all of these awards, and it's just kind of being spotlit, I guess. Yeah. For those of us who weren't already aware. These people were always writing, they were always amazing, but for one reason or another, we just weren't aware of it. And so I think that's a really interesting thing of what's going on right now in horror fiction and in sci-fi and in fantasy and in just all kinds of dark or speculative or again speculative fiction.
You're absolutely right. Having all of those voices, all of that representation, you're seeing it everywhere. Women, people of different genders. And you're a big advocate and a supporter, an ally for that too, which is very commendable.
Well, I think it's my responsibility because I have a platform, and my friend had a phrase that I've been using liberally without crediting him, that Jews are Schrodinger's people of color. We're white until the white people tell us that we're not, and so it's weird existing in this kind of liminal state. But as a white guy, I have a platform that people will listen to. Or people who would otherwise dismiss the same message might listen to it if it comes from a white guy. And so there's a responsibility that goes with that to make sure that you are a person of honor. And, any sort of bigotry, any sort of out-of-hand dismissal of an entire category of people, whether that's gender identity or sexual identity or ethnicity or economic class or nation of origin or anything. If you are dismissing an entire category of people, there's no way that you can do that and still consider yourself honorable. And so many people are doing it because it's this deeply enculturated white supremacy that whether we are engaging in it or not, we still benefit from it. The only way that we're going to undo those benefits, or rather democratize those benefits, we're not undoing them, is to make sure that there are people like me and like Mackenzie and Lisa at Ladies of the Fright who are making sure that they do the same thing, and like the Horror Writers Association and like SIFWA and all of these groups that are making sure that we spotlight the people who normally don't get the spotlight. And that's kind of one of the things I love about Shades and Shadows too, is that I get to bring people on who don't normally get a spotlight and go, hey, look at this cool person. Look what they're doing.
And I love that you do that. You bring people together in these community events where they can listen to stories, and you're supportive of authors. So tell us about that. Tell us more. What is Shades and Shadows, and how did it start?
Shades and Shadows is the only Los Angeles-based reading series that goes on year-round, promoting authors and works of science fiction, horror, fantasy, noir, dark fiction. The short version that I give to authors and publishers is, if NPR doesn't care about your book, I probably do. And it, for the first 5 years, the traditional format was 6 authors, and then I've dropped it down to 5 authors and changed the format a little. So there's 5 authors reading from their, usually reading from their recent works. And it spans the spectrum. I might have someone reading from a dark, supernatural, noir thriller piece, and then the next author will be reading from a young adult fantasy, and the next author will be reading from a space opera, and the next author will be reading from a vampire novel. And I never know what's going to exactly happen because I never filter or censor my authors. Like, ideally, I'm getting either ARCs or ebooks so that I can read them, so that I can help promote them accurately before the event. And even if I've read the book before the show, I'm still not sure what they're going to read because I trust my authors. And I trust them to do a good job. And I'll help them out. I send everyone like an attachment in an email of, here's what I found works for my audience.
Sure.
And the idea behind it is to bring authors together who might not otherwise share a lineup at any other event and let them interact with each other, because it's not just that they're reading from their books. There's also like when they're giving their context, if they're giving context for their book, they'll also frequently be interacting with the person who read right before them. There's an opportunity for the authors to engage with one another, and there's also an opportunity for authors to engage with audience members who wouldn't normally be exposed to that author. And there's an opportunity for audience members to broaden their horizons, because I find, and this isn't so much true anymore, though it is still more true than I'd like it to be, like the fantasy fans look at the sci-fi fans and go, man, why are you reading that stuff? And the sci-fi fans tend to look at the fantasy fans and go, man, why are you reading that stuff? And both of them tend to look at the horror fans and go, what the hell is wrong with you?
So tell me, have you ever, with all of these readings, has there ever been a reading where your jaw just dropped, where that something was just so shocking or so unexpected that you or the audience was just like, whoa?
For me personally, no. But I love watching. So if you come to a Shades and Shadows event, you will frequently find that while the authors are reading, I'm facing the audience a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that I love watching the audience reactions. And there have been a number of times where the audience has turned a little green at some of the readings. And I actually, for the LA Lit Crawl a number of years ago, I did a lineup that was specifically based on grossing out the audience as much as I possibly could. Ooh. And so I approached authors who had written either short stories or had written novels that it contained at least a good, solid passage of things that were just gross, and I loved it. And that's kind of part of the fun of it, too, is that you experience stories a little bit differently when you're hearing them versus when you're reading them. And especially if you're at an event where you can't just hit mute on the TV. Like, you're going to hear the rest of that story whether you want to or not. And so you give up a little bit of your control, and that kind of forces you into these elements of discomfort. And angst is the kind of psychological term that I ran across in my research for something a number of years back, that is that deep disquieting discomfort.
Yeah. And there's something very different, too, when you're reading as opposed to listening. Just the fact that it's coming to you orally, that I feel the imagination takes over more when you're just listening, because you can relax a little bit more. Your eyes aren't working. You're not working so hard at it. And it's like radio. It's like the theater of the mind, right? You can see it being played out and described for you. And again, it goes back to, there's just something really cool and awesome that happens when we can listen as well as tell stories, especially scary stories.
Yeah, well, and you kind of hit on this in your introduction, that scary stories are the oldest stories that we have as human beings. Mm-hmm. That scary stories were what we told around fires to keep people from wandering into the dark. They've always had some kind of social reinforcement element to them. And that's still present in this postmodern, like deconstructive era of storytelling, where we're subverting or inverting the stereotypes and the paradigms. There's still this idea of social reinforcement. We're just socially reinforcing subverting or inverting paradigms rather than reinforcing the paradigms themselves. But yeah, like there's some very basic human need that's satisfied by those scary stories.
Oh, yeah.
And it really does go back to the dawn of human civilization for it.
I love what you're doing with Shades and Shadows. I have been to several of them myself, and I've always had a great time. And you've branched out, too. You've done Seattle, right?
Yeah, I did Seattle. I'm hoping to get back. Unfortunately, the bookstore that I had partnered with there is no longer available to me. So I have to find a new venue to host the events there. But right now I'm also just focusing on getting the Los Angeles scene as robust as I can. And then I'm going to look to expand again.
Love that idea. Yeah, because I love your goals, too. This is something that could go nationwide.
Theoretically, yeah. I mean, I need to get a couple more people working alongside me to make sure that everything's going as smoothly as possible and none of us are overextended.
Yeah.
And at this point, I also need to point out, like, for the first 4 years of Shades and Shadows, I was working with a business partner, Lauren Candia, without whom this would not have been possible. And like you asked me a little bit ago to explain where Shades and Shadows came from, and I kind of skipped over that. But it was born because I had this idea of wanting to go to a reading series that was just for horror authors, and it didn't exist. So I thought, well, crap, I have to make it. But then I was introduced to Lauren by a mutual acquaintance who had the exact same idea and had the exact same response of, oh, well, then I guess I have to make it. And the two of us talked about it, and we agreed to team up and do it together. And we talked about expanding it beyond just horror, but to include science fiction and fantasy and all of the other things that can be included in this dark fiction umbrella. And she was instrumental in getting the author lineups, and she was instrumental in getting the venues, and she was instrumental in getting like the graphic design done. And a lot of these things that she was responsible for, I learned how to do through her. And I think it was our first anniversary show that we did that was a lineup of all women that, like, you know, we both had the idea kind of as a natural outgrowing of a conversation. It wasn't one idea or one person's idea or the other, but she was the one who put that lineup together.
Yeah. And
like the way I described it at one point, because I extrovert all over the place. and I said to someone, like, I'm the lighthouse while she's the anchor, which I know is kind of a skewed metaphor, but like I could be the person who, when we would go to conventions or literary festivals, I would be able to glad hand the entire room. And she was the one who was responsible for making sure that we followed up with the people who needed following up with. And it worked really well as a partnership. And she's doing other projects right now, and she's having her own life. And you know, we still talk every so often when time permits. And I'm forever going to be in her debt for teaching me how to do this, because if I hadn't had her as a partner for the first 4 years, I would never have been able to do it on my own.
And that's the cool thing about partnerships like that. And just, again, you're the kind of guy that embraces that support network. It's about you and her. You work together. You created something. She's not here anymore, but she still helped give birth to this. And it's very commendable that you are carrying this on. And to see, you know, I've watched the organization now for a couple of years, and your events, they grow and they get better, and they are such a delight. And again, such a great thing that you do for authors. And that's so just amazing. So thank you for doing that.
Oh, it's my pleasure. This is like every show I feel like I say, like, I get to stand up in front of a microphone and nerd out in front of an audience, and they're okay with this. And that's still neat to me.
Yeah.
And I get to reach out to these incredibly powerful, incredibly influential, incredibly fun authors and say, hey, I do a thing. Would you like to do my thing? And they keep saying yes. And I'm still not over the shock of that.
Authors don't say no to many things. They are eager. They are so appreciative of having that opportunity. I mean, they love to read and share their stories, so of course they're going to say yes.
And everything that I try to make sure that everything I do with Shades and Shadows is in service of the authors and in service of the readers and the audience.
Yeah.
Right. I'm the vehicle for this. I had the idea to create a space where these opportunities could happen. But it's not about me. It's not about what I can do. It's about the opportunities that I might be able to facilitate. And it's about the authors, and it's about getting the opportunity for readers to discover a new author, for authors to discover a new audience, for small press publishers to get their books out on the same signing table as some author from Tor or from Orbit.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's this incredible opportunity that I have to be a conduit.
And where can people find Shades and Shadows online? Or if they want to follow you on social media, where can people connect with you?
So Shades and Shadows is online at shadesandshadows.org, all spelled out. And you can find links on the website there to the Twitter page, to the Facebook page. You can follow us on Instagram. That's all available through the website. I'm pretty sure that and if it's not now there, it will be momentarily. My Twitter handle, which is also my Instagram handle, is available in my bio on the website. And I'm fairly easy to stalk online. Facebook, not so much. I tend to have my Facebook just for friends and authors that I work with. There's an email address on the website as well that you can use to get in touch with me for anyone who wants to be a reader. And
for anybody who wants to support Shades and Shadows as an organization, you know, sponsors, anybody who wants to sponsor or donate some money, because again, this is just something that is so amazing for the community. Yes, it's here in Los Angeles now. One day I know it's going to expand. And Xach Fromson, I thank you for being at the forefront of that. And thank you for joining us here today.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me, Desiree.
You bet. Once again, my name is Desiree Duffy. And thank you, everyone, for being with us today on Books That Make You. You can find out more on our website. That's booksthatmakeyou.com. And you can also follow us. We're on Instagram and on Facebook. Until next time, enjoy all the books that make you who you are.
The executive producer for Books That Make You is Desiree Duffy. Produced and sound mastered by Phil Giangrande. Engineering by Dave Nabox. Social media and promotion by Bree Sweeter. For more, visit booksthatmakeyou.com.